All right, there are at least two handouts. Now, if you were here last Sunday, you would have the notes for Lesson 8, unless you lost them. There are also some extra copies are back there, but there are two handouts. Lesson 9, and there's another handout called Ideas Have Consequences. So if you don't have those, they're back where Steve Spencer is at his table. So today we have just a little bit still on Lesson 8, and then we'll move forward. So if you have your notes from Lesson 8, we were discussing what is next. I'll read this to you. This is interesting. I think this is really true. It comes from a book written by Robert Lewis, who's actually a Western Seminary graduate. He's one of the better known graduates from that school. I went to that school. And he wrote a book a number of years ago now. The book is somewhat dated, but the statement here is really true. He's actually quoting a celebrity. Exposed to new and startling images, our response is always the same. First shock, then acceptance, followed by indifference. You know who said that? Anybody want to venture a guess? I'll read it again. Exposed to new and startling images, our response is always the same. First shock, then acceptance, followed by indifference. Madonna said that. Yeah. And you know the context in which she said that. The context was depicting scenes of homosexual behaviors of various sorts, whether through lyrics or through TV. She went on to say, the American public, digest it on a lot of different levels. Some people will see it and be disgusted by it, but maybe they'll be unconsciously aroused by it. People keep seeing it and seeing it and seeing it. Eventually, it is not going to be such a strange thing. So she said that over 20 years ago, and I think it's proven to be somewhat prophetic, you know. And I guess it also shows an agenda that has been worked out in our culture. All right, what is next? We talked about kind of rental marriages. We talked about polygamous marriages last week. The last one of these, this one, I mean, again, you hear this, and I think the tendency is to say, no way, this could not possibly happen. And I hope that is the case. I'm tempted to say that I agree with that. But then I look at some of the things that have happened in our culture over the last 20 years, and it's sort of like, well, maybe this is possible. But there are some people who are talking about incestuous marriage. And again, that's I read that and I think, surely not. But I read an article recently, and what really stood out to me in that article was the arguments that were being used in defense of this possibility. And the arguments, I'm not going to read the article to you, but the arguments were dignitary harm. Now, we've talked about dignitary harm. You know, if you don't respect what I'm doing, you're stripping dignity from me, and you can't do that. They also, in this article, talked about autonomy. The word autonomy was used. So, you know, individual autonomy, that I have a right to do what I want to do. They also talked about marriage separated from procreation, as in that would be a reason to prevent incestuous marriage would be, you know, procreation could lead to birth defects. But they said, no, if you separate marriage from procreation, then this would be acceptable. And then the fourth thing that I noted was an expert witness. They actually had a scholar saying this is not entirely unprecedented in human history. And so when I read that article and saw these arguments in that article, it made me think, well, these are the same arguments that have been used to promote all the other changes in our culture as well. So maybe it's not as far-fetched as we might think. I will make as a general observation, after spending really a number of months now just reading a lot and thinking a lot, here's a final thought. Some envision a future without marriage and therefore without the nuclear family. That's a fill-in in your notes. In this storyline, the subversion of marriage that we are witnessing in our culture serves the ultimate goal of destroying marriage completely as the foundational structure of society. And again, that sounds like a radical statement to make, but I don't know that it is, honestly. That the goal here among some of these people is really to change marriage and family, the nuclear family. And all that's going on in our culture is eroding those foundations. I don't know if I mentioned this before, but one of the things that's really interesting about gay marriage is that if you can go back 20 years, and if you listen to particularly homosexuals, men, they were not interested in marriage. Do you know this to be true? This is true. Gay men were not interested in marriage. And feminism in its radical forms is not interested in marriage, because marriage restricts patriarchy. And so I think what happened is, for the gay community to get behind the marriage movement was to become normalized if they can get married. I don't think that's where some of the more radical folks in this movement, I don't think that's where they want to end up. I think it's sort of a halfway place on their ultimate goal, which is to just erase gender lines, to erase the structures of our society. And what you would end up with is people identifying however way they want to identify, and marriage as we know it and family as we know it just doesn't really exist any longer. Now that's, to me, an Orwellian kind of prediction, or Brave New World. But if you read those two books, that's what you have, actually. And so Brave New World, I think, was written in the 1930s. That's a long time ago, but the author of that book is seeing that as where this could ultimately lead. Dan, I saw your...
No, I was just, when you talk about the structures, it seems like, when you think about what the structures God created, the whole framework of our worldview is kind of set up in Genesis 1 and 2, and everything in our culture is working hard at, really, I think is Satan working through it, is an unraveling of all those structures of Genesis 1 and 2. A complete unraveling, which things that you just don't, it's male and female, he created them. Well, you don't have to, they're trying to unravel that, right? A man shall leave his father and mother, and claim that the school become, they're trying to unravel that, and who, that God exists. It's just a complete unraveling of everything that God set up in Genesis 1 and 2, which is really, from a 30,000-foot view, it's like, it kind of makes sense, right? It's the ultimate, really the ultimate battle.
And it makes sense because when you spend enough time with this, what you start to realize is that the category of oppression is massive in the thinking of so many of these folks. And they view marriage and family as oppressive institutions. And so the only way to really set people free is to get rid of these institutions. Do you understand? From a certain perspective, marriage is incredibly oppressive also to men, because it limits their sexual freedom. okay? It's oppressive to women because then, the whole idea of patriarchy and, women being held back. And so these categories of oppressor and those who oppress, the victims and the oppressors, so many of these folks, I think they really want to just totally tear apart our structures in the thought that'll get rid of oppression in terms of relationships. Now, what that does to kids, of course, is how do kids survive without mom and dad and without family and without structures? But did a hand go up over here? Okay. All right, well, let me have you look just briefly at this sheet here. Ideas have consequences. And I put this together this week, and I hope this will make some sense to you. I think there's a lot of names here that you've probably heard of at some point. But a lot of these names, people in our culture would not associate, they wouldn't necessarily say that these are significant people. And if you said, well, Nietzsche, what did he believe? I think the average American would say, I don't know what he believed. But ideas have consequences, and these individuals had ideas that have percolated through our culture, okay? So people think in a Nietzschean kind of way, even though they don't know that's what they're doing. Because the ideas have been grabbed by the cultural shapers, like Hollywood, for instance, and these ideas get out there. And so these are some names of individuals when, in my own reading, seeing ideas in these individuals that have shaped our culture. And I found this fascinating, and so I just sat down and put some bullet points down. And I just want to share these with you as a partial explanation going back a couple hundred years, and we see their thinking today. So the first one of these is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and denial of original sin. Okay, so let me just stop and ask, what does that mean? What is denial of original sin?
People are really good.
Yeah, people are basically good. Is that a pretty? Do you hear that quite a bit in our culture?
Yeah, they never have children. They don't.
Yeah. Or they've had children, but the children are okay. The culture did something to the kids. I was listening to someone just the other day, and I can't remember who it was now, but the statement out of the person's mouth was, I believe that people are basically good. And I think that's very, very common in our culture today. So there's not a suspicion of the human heart, and so it makes you susceptible to following what you feel. Whereas from a Christian perspective, following what you feel is a dangerous thing to do, because the heart is desperately wicked. Who can understand it? New understanding of human selfhood. Do I have that on yours, or did I add that?
Yes.
What's that? Okay. Society with its beliefs, values, and customs make people inauthentic. That's a big deal among a lot of these guys when you start to read what they're saying. That authenticity is an enormously important value. Now, is that true in our culture today? Anybody read, is her name Demi Lovato? And she came out this week. And she is, I don't know much about her. I think she was one of these Disney stars, maybe a singer. And now she's a famous pop star, maybe. But she came out and she's changed her pronoun to thee, And she says, I don't know. I mean, she's kind of gender fluid. But she used that word, I've got being authentic. I've got to be true to myself. And so you hear that kind of language a lot in terms of the whole sexual revolution. So society with its beliefs, values, and customs makes people inauthentic. What does that mean?
They force certain traits upon people they have to outwardly adhere to. So they're not following their inner gaze. One thing I was going to say about the authenticity, that's an analogy, is somebody on the ocean taking, ancient ocean, taking their eyes off the Pole Star and looking at the ocean to guide their way. And that's exactly what's happening. You know, what in the world is in your inner self that is true.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't it like the movement of, if it feels good, do it? I do what I want to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a slogan like if it feels good, do it. You know, these ideas are kind of pushing in that direction. So Rousseau felt that people are basically good, but they've been held back by their society. And so he really envisioned sort of, you know, if we could just, at one level, if we could just sort of get people back to country and back to a simpler life and, you know, get people out of the cities, maybe out of the churches, and just sort of strip away the culture that has held them back and kept them from being authentic to themselves, that all of a sudden the human race would just sort of blossom and flower. Okay?
Well, this whole thing points back to the Old Testament and what they tried to do again and again and again, and it didn't work. And God came and punished, and they did it again, and God came and punished.
Mm-hmm.
It's on the road to becoming a God themselves.
Yes. Yeah, so a good book in response to this kind of thinking, I think, would be Lord of the Flies. If you read that book, probably some of you read that in school, where the grade school boys are on a plane and the plane shot down. It's some kind of a future war. Yeah, I think they're English school boys, and they end up on a desert island, and it's sort of, and there's plenty of food, and it's not a hard, they can keep themselves going. And the island is sort of presented as, it could be like a new Eden, a new beginning, a new opportunity for the human race, and all the oppressive structures have been pulled away, and these kids can start fresh. And of course, by the end of the book, they've turned into murdering little savages. So it's a good book, and it has a lot to say about the human heart. And so is the problem here something outside of us primarily, or is the problem something inside of us? And Rousseau would say it's outside of us. So, okay, Darwin, I mean, we're more familiar with him, right? Because, you know, evolution, the origin of species. The end of teleology. Telos is the Greek word, means end or goal or purpose. So, you know, Darwinianism, really, there's no purpose to life. In the full evolutionary worldview, we are grown-up germs. And so we come from the goo, we return to the goo. How has this been put before? From the goo by way of the zoo, or something like that. But, you know, I mean, there's no meaning, there's no purpose to life. So loss of God-given meaning, no transcendent ethical standards. And you can see, therefore, if there's no transcendence, then we start looking for meaning the only other place we can look, which is in ourselves. And so John Calvin, you know, years ago at the beginning of the Institutes of the Christian Religion, says that knowledge of God and knowledge of self, these two things are intimately connected. If you cut that tether, If you don't know who God is, you don't know who you are. And I mean, Darwin contributed to that. Nietzsche, God is dead and we have killed him. That's a quote. That's a much longer quote. He talks about essentially how proud the human race should be because they've managed to do this. Now, Nietzsche was an atheist. All of these individuals were atheists, so it's not like he believed that there was a real God who we developed technology and somehow went to heaven and, killed him in a war. Now, he's saying the idea of God. The idea of God is dead. We've killed him. We can explain the world without God, according to Nietzsche. There's a really interesting photo. Maybe some of you have seen it. Hitler was a real devotee of Nietzsche. And there's a photo of Hitler kind of bowing before a bust of Nietzsche. And so you can see, actually, these ideas in the final solution. If there is no God, then who does determine right from wrong? Well, Hitler said, I will. And Nietzsche had the idea of the Superman. Have you ever heard of this before? You know what I'm talking about? So Nietzsche said there is no God, so what we need are men who will seize the moment and will, what Kelly said, will become gods. And they'll have the conviction, the strength to shape the world in their own image. And Hitler read that idea, and he ran with that. And so if there is no God, well, I might as well be God. And if I think that 6 million Jews should be massacred, then, well, who's to say otherwise? This is trying to do ethics inside the box, right? When there's no outside reality. And yeah, it's very difficult for me to not become very exercised and angry with so many people in our culture who, it seems to me, are unwilling to think through the consequences of the ideas that they believe. Okay? So if you're sitting here today and you're thinking the whole idea of God is just kind of irrelevant to me, you need to realize where that has led many people in human history. It led Hitler to be a mass murderer. It came out of his belief system. And he got a lot of this from Nietzsche. So God is dead, we've killed him, liberation from the transcendence and the subsequent inward gaze. And so then the emergence of the plastic man. I did not invent those words, obviously, the plastic man. But the idea, we see that. What's the plastic man today? How might you describe this? The plastic man. What's that? How about gender fluidity? Doesn't that seem like plastic? We used to believe that your sex was male or female, and there's a binary. But now we've got this fluidity going on, and you kind of change and move in and out of genders and so forth. And so the plastic man, the psychological person. Marx. Oppressive nature of traditional structures. That's just huge in Marx. Critical philosophy of history. Deconstruct history. Undo history. History is a story of oppression. And we can't really, all we can do is cast shame upon the past. Do you see that in our culture today? Yeah, you all responded to that one. How do you see that in our culture?
Tearing down statues.
Tearing down statues, yeah. And the inability to see that history is more complicated than just simply black and white. That great men sometimes did bad things. But some of those men can still be called great men even though they did bad things. Now, Hitler's not one of those guys, right? There's some standard here where we say Hitler was a great man at a certain level who did horrific things, and therefore he's one of the, generally if you say who's the most evil person in history, Hitler usually is the top of the list. But there are men in our own history who were great men who did some pretty bad things. But we can, usually speaking, people will be able to make that distinction. And From the Marxist worldview, it's like, no, you just got to tear every statue down, and you've got to burn history down, because it's all about oppressors and those who oppress them, and those are the categories that we work out of. How have we seen this actually in the news in the last couple of weeks? I'm thinking of international politics. Israel and the Palestinians, or Israel and Hamas. That's the distinction, right? The Palestinians are oftentimes the victims in some of this, right? They're not all, some Palestinians they're just ordinary people trying to get by in the world. But Hamas is a terrorist organization, but Israel is the oppressor. And the other side, they're oppressed. This is the worldview. And so down with Israel. And so even in American cities right now, you've got Jewish people being held responsible for the politics of the state of Israel. And I don't know if you saw the video of the man who was being beaten because he's Jewish. And so Israel is much like the police in our culture. The police are terrible, right? We all know this, right? Yeah, because they're oppressors and they represent this oppressive culture. And so we've just got to tear it all down. And if we tear it all down, what are we going to find? Well, people are basically good. The structures are holding people back here, folks. So that takes you all the way back to Rousseau. So these ideas really do trickle down. So oppressive nature of traditional structures. History of society is a history of oppression, so you got to deconstruct the society. Categories of oppressor versus oppressed. I mean, Marx is all over all of those things. And then Freud. Sex is deepest, truest identity. Is that in our culture today? I mean, sex is no longer primarily an act. Sex is an identity. There's a difference there, isn't there? It's the deepest identity. It's the truest you. Whereas from the Christian worldview, we would say, no, being made in the image of God, being a child of God, that's the deep identity. But not in this worldview. Sex is the deepest, truest identity. So sex isn't just an act, it's an identity. Civilization and religion are necessary evils. This is really interesting in Freud. Freud was really anti-civilization, and he was anti-religion. He's an atheist through and through. And he holds this in common with so many of these other individuals. You can see Marx, how he wants to tear civilization apart and remake it. And Rousseau is wanting to get back to nature and its structures that have created all these problems. And Freud agreed with that, and yet he hedged his bet. So civilization and religion are necessary evils. Now, why are they evils? Because they oppress. Yeah, he's with Marx on this. Why are they necessary? What's that?
We need order. There's got to be some order somewhere.
Yeah, Freud's more of a realist, I guess, in comparison to some of these other thinkers. He realizes that civilization is necessary, but he hated it. And religion is necessary, and yet it is evil. Because for Freud, the sex instinct is the truest truth about everybody. And of course, the church comes along and puts out rules that restrict people's freedoms. And so I guess you'd say Freud was conflicted somewhat. What's really interesting, though, is putting Marx and Freud together. And putting Marx and Freud together, you've got the culture we're living in. So psychology trumps biology. You see how that's a Freudian idea? Yeah, because Freud's all about the inner self and the emotional person or the plastic person. And so the transgender movement can be summarized in those three words: psychology trumps biology. It's not determined by, again, it's crude, but it makes a point. Between what's between your legs, it's between what's between your ears. That determines your sex or your gender. And that's a psychological idea, isn't it? And it's a rejection of biology. But that's totally Freud. Atheism leads to the autonomous self. That's true of all of these individuals. If there is no God who's an authority, then I become the authority. And then Marxist categories of oppression wedded to sexual identities. You see the significance of that one? Marxist categories of the oppressed and the oppressor wedded to sexual identities, which is coming from Freud. And you put those two together, you've got a toxic brew that's ripping our culture apart today. Those holding to traditional morality are oppressors, obviously. And then, of course, Freud wouldn't have used these categories. He was not aware of LGBTQ. But those in the LGBTQ community are obviously the oppressed. Now, I've got a paragraph here, because I added to this after I made those photocopies. So I'll just read this paragraph on my sheet. The notion of assault on the person becomes not simply, or even perhaps primarily, a matter that involves damage to the body or to property. It becomes psychological, something that damages the inner self or hinders that sense of psychological well-being that lies at the heart of the therapeutic. In such a context, freedom of speech becomes not so much part of the solution as part of the problem. Liberal democracies have long assumed that the free exchange of ideas in society is a means of preventing totalitarianism and promoting the common good. In the world of psychological man, however, it serves rather to give legal protection to verbal assaults on the person. Now, do you follow the logic of that? You know, our laws have said if you go out and you grab someone and you beat them up physically, you're in trouble. And we all agree with that. But we've now come to a place where if you do psychological harm to a person, if you do dignitary harm to a person, if you assault them in some way through free speech, that's now increasingly viewed as like assaulting someone with a brick. And so, you know, we see this on a regular basis now where freedom of speech is being threatened because it violates this inner psychological person that everybody's now sort of latched onto and claiming to be. I'm going to be authentic. I'm going to be true to myself. And if you say that you've got a problem with that, you've attacked me in a way that some are saying should be, you know, you should be held liable before the law for doing that. And so we scratch our heads and wonder, how did we come to this place? And I think the answer is right here, at least in part, on this sheet of paper, just looking through some of the ideas going back a couple hundred years that have shaped the culture that we're living in today. So I'll stop there and just ask, are there any questions or comments? I realize this might be a little bit, I don't know, I might put a few of you asleep because this is a little bit deeper maybe than some of the other things we've talked about. But any thoughts?
It occurs to me, you go down through all of these things, there's one consistent sort of pattern to all of the topics, no matter what they are, whether it's the critical race theory stuff that's going on in the schools, the sex education that's going on in the schools, the Palestinians and the Jews, which, you know, we've lived with those all our lives, so we don't really think about it too much. But it goes clear back to the very first story in the Bible, is that it sets two groups against each other. Every one of these things that you went through, if you think about it, divides people into two camps at least. And that's what's going on in our culture right now. And just as you said with the speech, some people have free speech and others apparently now don't. And so there's a conflict there. Everything is two-sided in all of these arguments. And
And so what are the two groups? You said there's two groups. I assume I know which, how do you identify the two groups?
Well, I think the groups are somewhat fluid, and you can't just say, you're in this group and you're in this group. I don't think that's the point. I think the point is to take every situation you can in the culture and divide it in half, and make it into two groups.
I think that's right, because now we have vaccinated people and non-vaccinated people. That were eating.
What did they say?
Well, Dick brought in the categories of vaccinated people and non-vaccinated people.
Yeah. And it appears that somebody wants a lot of conflict with something on.
You were going to speak before Lloyd. She put her hand up, and Lloyd.
I blurted last time, so I better change my behavior. I do agree with what you're saying with the division of the two camps, and it is following right back into the oppressor and the oppressed, which is critical race theory, right?
Well, and it's Marx. That's Marx's original thing. That's where the communism,
Yeah,
that's the rock they're based on,
yeah,
is two groups,
yeah.
the haves and the have-nots. It was pretty simple in his day. In our day, it's a little more complicated. They didn't have a middle class, so it doesn't really work in America. It's harder to make that range because people can change classes in America. In Marx's day, they couldn't.
And now it's race and sexual identity.
It's just in
That's where the
everything.
line is.
Yeah, and that's where we're going to go in the coming weeks as we look at through these notes. That Marxism has been modified, but in the category of oppressed, you do have now these sexual identity groups. But the Marxist worldview is being applied to those issues. Yeah.
And you said earlier something about where do the kids go now if all, and if you guys want to look at something that I think is very fascinating, is a man named Christion. So if you write that down, you can go Google it later. He does a very good analysis of this stuff. And he did a thing on the monsters in Portland or whatever, the child monsters in Portland. And he went through 3 school districts down there, and he's got some insiders that gave him a bunch of information on the training that teachers are being put through and everything else. And it occurred to me when you were talking about how they combine this stuff, Marx, the oppression and the sexual identities, and it just hit me that CRT, the critical race theory is one part of that, and then the CSE, like going on in Washington pretty significantly, the comprehensive sexual education, that's your 2 pieces right there. And so these kids are going to school, and that's where they're getting it. That's where they're mommy and daddy.
So the school system is becoming mom and dad, is what you're saying?
In a way, yeah.
But there are governors that are standing up against
There
it,
are.
which is encouraging.
Yeah, and you do see actually a lot of pushback on some of the stuff we're going to be talking about in weeks to come. There is a lot of pushback, and hopefully that'll make a difference. So.
I think it's interesting that the polls of Marxists and this whole group, when you look at it, you don't see any real joy and satisfaction coming out of that. And I always think it's so funny, Freud developed psychoanalysis as a form of counseling. And it's so interesting that it's lost favor. Primarily, it was used by super wealthy people who would be under psychoanalysis for years and years, and they would be just as screwed up as the other. And you see people who are protesting, you're not seeing any satisfaction, joy, you're just thinking, you see more and more and more anger. People who are not adhering to that, they just kind of want to say, yeah, I'd like to get back to my life now.
Yeah, and there are some Christian writers who, I read a book here just recently where the author made the point that one of our most powerful apologetics or evangelistic opportunities is really in the whole issue of beauty and joy, creating a alternative culture that would actually be appealing to people because they see something in it that they desperately desire and don't have, because they are miserable. Yeah. And another thing you said, which is really true, Freud has been largely discredited and discounted. His theories have been. And yet, he's still influential, right? At the level of psychoanalysis, he was wrong on all that. But his ideas have still come through, particularly what he says about, sexuality being the driving impulse of the human race and the primary identity.
That's true of Darwin, too.
Yeah. But I think thinking of putting Marx and Freud together, I think is really, and Carl Trueman's written a book where he makes that argument, and I think he's really, really right. Of course, the other thing, I'm sure I've said this already, what all these men, I think, have in common, Rousseau, I don't know, maybe I could be mistaken on this, but they're all atheists. I mean, they're all atheists, and that definitely drives where they end up. All right, well, let's look at lesson 9 then. But hopefully in what we've just looked at, you realize there isn't a clean break between starting to look at critical race theory and the sexual politics stuff. These things do get woven together because it's the same ideology is producing both. And we'll see that actually here is with what we'll just read next. Now, I've said this many times, and I know that you all agree with this. I assume you all do anyway. When you talk about Black Lives Matter, the difference between the slogan and the ideology, right? So it is important that thinking Christians clearly distinguish between Black Lives Matter as a slogan and as an ideology. Christians, of course, affirm that Black Lives Matter because all lives matter. Right, Seaside? Yeah. I mean, there's been a few times when I've wanted, because he's made me mad a few times over the years, but I love my son, right? I mean, all lives matter. I've got a shirt that was given to me, I think when I turned 50. I think the church gave it to me. I mean, you wheeled me out in a wheelchair, and you gave me a shirt that says, old lives matter. And it's funny, I'm self-conscious to wear that shirt in public. So I've relegated it to a jogging shirt. I guess when I'm jogging, because I run so fast that they don't have time to read the shirt, But yeah, I mean, we're afraid. We don't know what kind of trouble we'll get into if you say something like all lives matter, because there's a lot of people today who would say that's a really racist comment. And they really mean that. So Christians affirm that Black lives matter because all lives matter. Black people are made in the image of God. And so we got to always come back to that. That's our answer to the identity issue. All people are made in the image of God and therefore are of equal worth, value, and dignity with all other members of the human family. So, I put that little cartoon on the back. Did you see that cartoon? I don't know where, do I? Judge not by the content of his character, but by the color of his skin. And you see the little guy, the little white boy in chains of critical race theory, his mouth's been taped shut. I mean, that's such a sad, we joke about that, right? But isn't that sad? And there's a lot of things your mind should be thinking as you read that. Judge not by the content of his character. When you read those words, who do you think of?
Dr. King.
Dr. King, right? You know, in his famous speech where he said that he's longing for the day when his children will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And now we have taken that idea, it seems, and totally reversed that. And it's really a reminder to us, this is just a historically true statement, the current Black Lives Matter movement has nothing in common with the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. Because the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s was rooted in biblical ideas by and large, and the leaders of that movement were mostly ministers. You know, they were pastors. Dr. Martin Luther King was a pastor. Now, I mean, his personal life wasn't the best. Martin Luther King would be in the category of what I said earlier, a great man with some pretty big flaws. But we should be able to see and to recognize the greatness in him despite the flaws. But he was right. I mean, he was longing for a society where people would be judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. But if you're familiar, and I'm sure Lloyd is very familiar, because I know he follows these things, he's on the school board, the 1619 curriculum, and what's going on in so many of the school systems now where it's absolutely the color of your skin that seems to be the really important issue here. So, all right. I want to look here, Black Lives Matter in their own words, and I've put here in quotation marks what we believe. I've just taken this from their identity document. They have an identity document, and I haven't looked at it recently. I don't know if they've tweaked this at all because they've received pushback or not. But this was from a few months ago, and I just went on their website. I just copied it, and I pulled out some of the paragraphs that are the most problematic. I mean, I'm acknowledging that these are the more problematic statements that they make. But it shows you that if you buy into the ideology, you're buying a whole worldview. Okay, it's so much more than just a slogan. So we are guided by the fact that all Black lives matter. Okay, so far so good. We agree with that. Regardless of actual or perceived sexual identity, gender expression, economic status, ability, disability, religious beliefs or disbeliefs, immigration status or location. So all of a sudden, the sexual identity language is just creeping right into this discussion. We make space for transgender brothers and sisters to participate and lead. And let's step back for a moment. And who are the founders of Black Lives Matter?
3 women.
It's 3 women.
Marxist ideology.
Marxist ideology. And they're lesbians. I think they're lesbians. I don't know. They might identify elsewhere on the LGBTQ continuum, but they're on that continuum. So, yeah, so it's not surprising that this stuff would be in the document because that's where they're coming from. We make space for transgender brothers and sisters to participate and lead. We are self-reflexive and do the work required to dismantle cisgender privilege. What does the word cisgender mean? Yeah, it's what we used to refer to as just ordinary people. Men who are men who identify as men, and women who are women who identify as women and marry each other. But now this new word has been invented, cisgender, to describe what used to be just normal folks. So dismantle cisgender privilege. Do you hear Marx in that? There's the privileged group and there's the underprivileged group, and these two are at war with each other. And so our goal is to dismantle cisgender privilege and uplift black trans folk, especially black trans women who continue to be disproportionately impacted by trans antagonistic violence. So are you going to find me out holding a Black Lives Matter sign? No. There's no way. Because this is what they're really talking about. Okay? It's not what Dr. King talked about of people being judged by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. Someone raised their hand?
In Hamilton, I noticed they used to have a really big sign that said Black Lives Matter. I've noticed lately it is down and they've got the flag in the good stuff.
So on a bulletin board or on a signboard?
Do you think that people knew early on what that really meant?
No, I think probably, I'm assuming that a lot of people just, Black Lives Matter, that sounds like civil rights, and I support civil rights because racism is clearly wrong, and so they're thinking more, this is Martin Luther King Part 2.
Because that was really, you had to dig down deep to find it, and Ray's the one that told us about it, and I was like, oh, really? And I started digging. It took a while to dig down and find that information.
Yeah, but it shows you how much the culture's changed from the 1960s to 1921. It's a totally different worldview that's driving this.
You notice up on LeGrand, there's a big poster on the highway, Black Lives Matter. And you talked about, you find this on the East Coast and West Coast, but is that probably because there's a university, a state university, that's there?
I would suspect that LeGrand would be a more progressive liberal culture than Hermiston because of Eastern Oregon University. I would suspect that that's true. Now, Eastern Oregon University is not Harvard. I'm saying in terms of worldview. They're not nearly as left as Harvard because they're situated in rural Eastern Oregon. But if you're going to find the liberal element in LeGrand, I'm sure it's associated with the university.
Are these just signs that people can rent? So maybe
It's the sign you drive by.
oh, so it's a government billboard in the city.
People raise money for
Okay, well, let me keep reading. We build a space that affirms black women and is free from sexism, misogyny, and environments in which men are centered. Misogyny is, like female hater. Environments which men are centered. I'm going to tell you, I think that's a pretty terrible statement. I mean, not everyone would perhaps agree with me on that, but it's a divisive statement. It's saying that men and women should be at war with one another. And again, it's part of what's called the patriarchy. And we've got to tear down the patriarchy. We've got to destroy any semblance of roles between men and women. And by the way, the Trinity is really helpful to think about some of these issues because the Trinity is a perfect relationship. It's an eternal relationship between three persons who are co-equal, co-eternal. And yet, even within the Trinity, there are differences in terms of roles. And so the Trinity reminds us that there can be a relationship that is not oppressive, that is not evil in any sense, where there's an equality of essence, even though there are distinguishing characteristics within the roles played. So within the Trinity, Father and Son are equal, and yet the Father is the Father and the Son is the Son. And so the Father does initiate and lead in that relationship. And so that's been very helpful to me. So a statement like this one, I think, is just saying that patriarchy in any form is a terrible thing and needs to be absolutely destroyed. Which what that's saying is that, say, for instance, spiritual leadership within the home by men is a terrible thing and should be destroyed. And I don't think it is a terrible thing, and I don't think it should be destroyed. So, yeah.
I think one of the difficulties for, even making an argument for the Christian worldview in our culture is that there's fewer and fewer people, particularly young people, that have actually observed healthy relationship, right? So,
yeah.
when the hatred of a patriarchy, or that the idea of the evil of a patriarchy comes from people who have only observed very poor relationships within a family structure, or they haven't seen men, they haven't seen a godly man, right? And so,
Yeah.
And so that it's kind of understandable their hatred of that. And I think it's harder and harder. It makes it more and more important for Christian people to model healthy relationships, particularly to their children, and to the children around them. People don't see it.
Yeah, that's a $200 contribution to our discussion today. I mean that as high praise. I mean, because that is so important, and it also does allow us to have compassion for some of these people who I so vehemently disagree with. You think about these three women who are the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement. What did their home life look like when they were little girls? I don't know the answer to that, but I can kind of guess. And what maybe happened to them as little girls, and how were they abused by men as little girls. And so it's created this toxic ideology, but it's coming out of their experience of life and the pain that they probably went through, and the lack of seeing relationships done in a healthy kind of way. So that's a huge part to all of this. So one of the things that all of us can do is seek to build healthy families and raise up kids on God's pattern. Yeah.
This is a critical issue that we need to focus. Oregon Department of Education has endorsed Black Lives Matter. And it's starting to run through, along with critical race theory, through the schools in Western Oregon now. This was an issue that I tackled some time ago because of how I serve through the ESD, through a state board, which I'm going to be the chairman of next year. And it's constantly a battle. In fact, so much so, I thought about resigning. You can't believe the pressure.
Yeah.
It just keeps coming.
Yeah. And I can't believe the pressure that you would be under. I'm sure it is immense.
However, if I give up, that voice won't be there. And so I refuse to give up. And we need to refuse to give up from this social engineering that's taking place in our society in Oregon. And we need to stand in battle as Christians for what is right.
Yeah. And we need to pray for Kelly and people, Lloyd's and school board. One of the breakdowns of our society is this issue where people do not participate in these kinds of organizations the way they once did. Have you noticed that? That's a real problem. And Christian people need to participate in these organizations. And that needs to be a value that somehow, we encourage Christians to be involved and to have that voice represented.
Right to Life put a big effort into school board elections that just happened. And I think they got about half of the number that they supported.
It's amazing to me when you think about how small the LGBTQ plus community is, the amount of influence that they exercise. And some of it is actually explainable this way. Traditionally speaking, LGBTQ people are better educated, and they make more money, and they don't have kids. That gives them a lot of time to involve themselves in causes. Whereas, a lot of us, like my experience is I pastor this church and I'm a father and I've got a family and that's where I put my energy. But it's amazing to me how many, mayors and people in politics identify as LGBTQ plus. And so they're very, very active. And we need to be active too. Recognizing that our message is really, I don't want to misstate that too. The church, our weapon is the gospel, okay? But we also need to realize that we need to vote and we need to exercise an influence in some of these other areas as well. Well, let me finish this because we're running out of time. We make spaces family friendly. This is the one that's harder for me to understand exactly what's being said. I'll acknowledge that. We make spaces family friendly and enable parents to fully participate with their children. We dismantle the patriarchal practice that requires mothers to work double shifts so that they can mother in private even as they participate in public justice work. We disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure requirement by supporting each other as extended families and villages that collectively care for one another, especially our children, to the degree that mothers, parents, and children are comfortable. Now, I say I don't understand some of what they're saying here, but I think I get the main idea, which is pretty toxic to traditional family and to nuclear family and so forth. By the way, one of the principles that I've found very useful over a long time now is the principle of subsidiarity. And that principle is simply this: the best decisions, generally speaking, are made at the most local level. Okay? So when you've got the federal government making all the decisions for everybody else at a local level, that's usually not a good situation. And that's, of course, a big problem in our culture. But when you think about family, who's going to make the best decision for kids? Generally speaking, mom and dad, right? Now, if mom's, a crack addict, then maybe not. I mean, we realize, and this goes back to the collapse of the family, but traditionally speaking, basically speaking, mom and dad make best decisions for their children. But this paragraph is questioning that, right? And I think it's a very unhealthy statement. The last one here: we foster a queer affirming network when we gather. And by the way, queer used to be a dirty word. Now it's a good word again. That's interesting too. Some of these words, they come in and out. Because when I was younger, if you used that word, that was like a profanity. But now the gay community has affirmed that word. So we foster a queer affirming network. When we gather, we do so with the intention of freeing ourselves from the tight grip of heteronormative thinking, or rather the belief that all in the world are heterosexual unless she, he, or they disclose otherwise. So I took these paragraphs out of a 2-page document, and this is about half a page. And so there's some other things in the document that I don't have any concerns with, but these paragraphs represent an ideology, I think, which we all should have great concern with. All right, so we'll end today. Then we're going to come back next week, and we'll start to look at understanding intersectionality. And we'll just continue to walk through this, okay? At some point,